Managing electrolyte balance is of equal importance as maintaining fluid balance. And the kidneys play a very important role in maintaining homeostasis when it comes to electrolytes. The kidneys match the excretion of sodium and potassium and chloride, bicarbonate, phosphate, etc., to the amount that is ingested, so that blood levels remain, relatively speaking, constant. Control of sodium levels is incredibly important. Not only is it important in regulating and managing blood pressure and blood volume, but it's also incredibly important in maintaining electrical activity or membrane potential for electrical cells. Likewise, the potassium levels important in maintaining membrane potential and for electrically active cells, including the skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle. The hormone aldosterone plays a very large role, very important role in managing this sodium and potassium balance that exists. Aldosterone promotes the reabsorption of sodium and the secretion of potassium. Aldosterone is released from the adrenal cortex. You'll recall that the adrenal gland sits on top of the kidneys like a little hat, and that it has an outer rim called the cortex, or an outer portion called the cortex, and an inner portion called the medulla. The outer portion secretes cortisol, so mineralocorticoids, and glucocorticoids. Aldosterone is the mineralocorticoid. Now, most of sodium and potassium are actually reabsorbed early in the nephron and the proximal tubules in an unregulated manner. You'll remember those co-transporters that exist, glucose, for example, being co-transported with sodium. Those are not regulated by aldosterone. What is regulated by aldosterone are sodium and potassium transporters found in more distal regions of the tubules. Let's look at the stimuli for sodium and potassium, for aldosterone release, really. Aldosterone is going to be released in response to low blood pressure. Okay. Now, you might be thinking that blood pressure has nothing at all to do with sodium, but it actually does. Because remember osmosis, water is going to follow the solutes. And so aldosterone, which promotes the reabsorption of sodium, indirectly promotes the reabsorption of water because of osmosis. And as water is reabsorbed, that will increase blood volume, which in turn increases blood pressure. So the stimuli, blood pressure dropping, when blood pressure goes down, that stimulates a secretion of aldosterone, which elevates the blood pressure by increasing blood volume together with antidiuretic hormone. The other stimuli for aldosterone released is this potassium. When potassium is released, when potassium is elevated in the bloodstream, that will trigger the release of aldosterone, which in turn triggers the secretion of potassium. Secretion of potassium increases the amount of potassium that is going to show up in the urine and be excreted from the body. Now note this. If osmolarity is very high, aldosterone release will be suppressed. And that holds true even if potassium levels are high. So imagine a situation where you might have elevated potassium levels, but you also have really elevated sodium levels. If aldosterone were released in that situation, aldosterone would promote the reabsorption of sodium, which would elevate sodium levels in the bloodstream even more, which would actually do the opposite of maintaining homeostasis. It would push us out of homeostasis even further. And so we have this control, or this regulatory switch, if you will, that prevents the release of aldosterone if if sodium levels in the bloodstream are too high, even if potassium is high, and even if blood pressure is low. Okay? We're going to look at the details of this and study in particular this RAS pathway, okay? Also called the RAAS pathway. And we did introduce this to you in the cardiovascular system because it is important in regulating and maintaining blood pressure. And so we're going to look at that in more detail. The renin angiotensin aldosterone system, known as this RAS or RAAS, either abbreviation is fine with me. This system is triggered by this low blood pressure stimuli, okay? And we're going to look at how this works, okay? We're going to dig into this and see this. Go back in your mind, or come back with me. Look at this figure on the right. This shows you the juxtaglomerular apparatus. You'll remember, or at least I hope you'll remember, these cells that I'm highlighting here. Let's do a different color that's a little better. We'll just highlight the purple cells in purple. That works. Those purple cells detect sodium levels as it passes by and are involved in regulating that GFR. Remember how this is going to help regulate net filtration pressure and therefore regulate GFR, glomerular filtration rate, by regulating that afferent arteriole and whether or not that afferent arteriole is going to dilate or constrict. These cells, okay, you'll have some of them in here, and you have some of them around, around here and here. These are called the granular cells or granulosa cells, and they secrete an enzyme known as renin. When blood pressure drops, okay, so we're going to have a decrease in blood pressure, the amount of stretch, okay, is going to decrease. So arterial stretch that's hard to read, but it says arterial stretch decreases. Okay, arterial stretch decreases. And in response to this decrease in stretch receptors in this region detect that change and trigger these granulosa cells. And these granulosa cells dump renin into circulation. Okay, so renin is dumped into circulation. Renin will travel. Okay, it's going to travel through the glomerulus, and it's going to travel out through this efferent arteriole. It's a protein. It's an enzyme, so it won't be filtered. From the efferent arteriole, it's going to make it back into the main circulation. Okay, it's going to make it back into the main circulation. Now, low blood pressure, I mentioned, affects this. Another thing that will affect it is decreased GFR, but we're primarily going to focus on the low blood pressure. Now, what does renin do? Well, renin's a protein, renin's an enzyme. Okay, renin is an enzyme. And this enzyme, let's dig into this diagram right here. Okay, let's look at this. This enzyme right here, this lovely little enzyme right here, that is now circulating in the blood, is going to encounter a protein called angiotensinogen. Now, angiotensinogen is constantly produced by the liver. As far as I know, as far as I've been able to research and dig, which angiotensinogen has no pharmacologically active, or no, I should say, physiologically active role other than to just exist. It's present in the bloodstream at all times. but it really isn't doing anything specific. It is, anytime you see this OGN, okay, you can consider this, you can assume that this is a precursor. It's a precursor molecule, okay? When angiotensinogen interacts with renin, it will bind into the active site of renin, and it is catalyzed into angiotensin 1. So we can say clearly that angiotensinogen is a substrate for the enzyme renin, which makes angiotensin 1 the product for this chemical reaction. Angiotensin 1 also does not seem to have any physiological activity other than binding to another enzyme. Now, the second enzyme is called angiotensin converting enzyme, or ACE. ACE happens to be found in the blood vessel endothelium, so it's actually part of the blood vessel walls, particularly in the lungs. Okay, most often found in the lungs, but it is elsewhere in the body as well. Okay, it's common in the lungs. ACE takes this angiotensin 1 and converts it into angiotensin 2. So angiotensin 1 is the product of renin, but the substrate for ACE. And that means that angiotensin 2 is the product of ACE, angiotensin converting enzyme. Now, angiotensin 2 binds to tissues that have angiotensin 2 receptors. And those angiotensin 2 receptors are found in a variety of regions or areas in the body. You'll find them on smooth muscle in the arterioles. You'll also find them in the cardiovascular control center in the medulla oblongata in the brain. They are also found in the hypothalamus, also in the brain. They are in the adrenal cortex as well. Okay, also not in the brain. Not in the brain. And they're on the proximal tubules of the kidneys. Each of these have angiotensin 2 receptors. Okay. And these angiotensin 2 receptors will be activated. The arterioles vasoconstrict in response to activation. The cardiovascular control centers stimulate the sympathetic nervous system to increase cardiac output. The hypothalamus stimulates the sympathetic nervous system. The hypothalamus triggers the release of antidiuretic hormone from the posterior pituitary. Also regulates behavioral modifying, it triggers thirst. That's probably the better way of saying it. And the adrenal cortex begins to secrete aldosterone. Both the adrenal cortex and the activity on the proximal tubules results in sodium reabsorption. These two, so sodium reabsorption elevates osmolarity, thirst adds water, and antidiuretic hormone also results in water retention. And so collectively, we increase water while maintaining blood osmolarity. Let's go back up to this circle region. Let me highlight it so you can see where I'm talking about. This region right here. I want you to look at this and notice these factors. I've already mentioned that GFR will also trigger the release of renin, okay? Because it stimulates that macula densa cells to release these paracrines that regulate these granule cells that cause us to produce renin. Sympathetic activity will also do it as well, okay? Will also do it as well. But note the direct effect of the blood pressure. And that's the main one that I want you to focus on. Yes, each of these other parts are important, and yes, please be aware of them. But the more direct effect is that blood pressure affecting those granular cells of the afferent arteriole, surrounding that afferent arteriole. I want you to really focus on this and really learn this pathway. And these next slides essentially walk through what I just talked about, so we can see the decrease in blood pressure being the trigger, an increase in sympathetic activity being the trigger, a decrease in GFR being a trigger, and then angiotensin being released from the liver, renin catalyzing angiotensin to angiotensin 1, ACE catalyzing the conversion of angiotensin 1 into angiotensin 2. Sorry, that angiotensin 2 should be in bold, but I forgot apparently. So please look at this. Please practice this. Please understand this and make this a part of your understanding. I want to look and talk about the mechanism of aldosterone action, but we're going to look at that in the next video.